All right, so the next chapter we're going to take a little bit of a look at is chapter 16. We're going to start off with female reproductive organs first, anatomy, as well as talk a little bit about the menstrual cycle and pregnancy at the beginning of this week, and then we'll kind of switch gears and talk mostly about male reproductive at the end of next week, beginning of the following week, okay? All right, so reproductive system, primarily what we're referring to or talking about for the most part are what are called gonads, so the primary sex organs of both males and females. So males, obviously, the primary sex organs are the testes. That's where the sperm is being produced, and the egg for females is being produced in the ovary. Those gonads are producing different types of cells than we normally have been talking about. So they're producing what are called gametes or sex cells. Uh, the sex cells only contain 23 chromosomes. Normal cells, remember if you think back all the way to bio, normal cells contain 46 chromosomes. So what we're doing here is we're combining a sperm cell and an egg cell to get that 46, but to do that, both of them have to contain half the number. So these are the cells made during meiosis, and everything else is really made during mitosis. All right. So female reproductive first, there's kind of broken into three parts. So we have the ovary itself, the duct system, so the system that leads away from the ovary, and then the external genitalia. Okay. All of the female reproductive organs fit pretty much right inside of the pelvis. So the pelvis would be right about this level here. So it would go straight across. The ovary kind of sits right at the top of the pelvis, and then all the other organs kind of sit down through the bottom of the pelvis. Okay. All right, so the ovary itself is composed of a couple different things. They're composed of these what are called ovarian follicles, these little kind of areas where there is a maturing egg cell happening in there, and then once the egg cell ruptures during ovulation, it goes back into this kind of healing stage. So we can kind of see that process in a circular pattern here in the diagram off to the right. But the structure of the ovarian follicle, we have an oocyte or an egg, right? That's the little ovule there. Follicular cells, those are the cells around the outside of the egg that are there to help mature it. And this is what's called corpus luteum. Corpus luteum then is the cells that are resulting from that ovary ejecting an egg cell and then it healing itself as it goes through that. The corpus luteum's primary objective then, once the egg cell has been released, is to produce both progesterone as well as estrogen. Okay. All right, so ovarian follicle stages. So you have a primary follicle. This is an immature egg or oocyte. You have a Graafian follicle. This is one that's starting to grow and hit maturity. Ovulation is the period where the egg cell is released. This occurs usually about every 28 days. All right. It's about day 14 of the menstrual cycle or so, or somewhere in there. And then the ruptured follicle then is transformed back into that corpus luteum. And the idea here is if we had an ovulated egg or an egg that was released and it became fertilized, we need this corpus luteum to continue to produce progesterone and estrogen so that we can continue to keep the uterus in check, so that the ovulated egg or the fertilized egg has a place to go. All right, we got a couple support structures for the uterus as well as the fallopian tubes themselves. There's a couple different ligaments here that I just want to highlight real quick. So we have what's called the round ligament here. All right, it attaches the uterus down to the pelvis itself. We have another one called the broad ligament. This one kind of goes in between the fallopian tube and the ovary. Okay, and then you have an ovarian ligament that then holds the ovary in place next to the uterus. Okay. All right, the uterus and fallopian tube here is what we're going to talk about next. So the fallopian tube actually attaches to the top portion of the uterus, but the fallopian tube does not actually attach to the ovary. Okay, so there's actually an opening in between those two. There are, at the end of the fallopian tube, we have these little kind of finger-like projections called fimbriae, and you can see them over here on the diagram to the right. They are there to help receive that oocyte or egg once the ovary releases it. All right. Inside of the fallopian tube, there are cilia. They beat towards the uterus, so they're kind of fanning this egg along so that it will make its way to the uterus. And the big thing here that you need to remember is that if fertilization is to take place, fertilization actually takes place in the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. It doesn't actually take place in the uterus, and it doesn't take place outside of that. It can. There are cases. There have been documented cases where an egg cell was actually fertilized before it reached the fallopian tube, but in most cases that cell is going to die because it needs to make its way down into the uterus to continue growing. If it gets fertilized in the fallopian tube and doesn't make it out of the fallopian tube, again, it usually dies. They refer to those as ectopic pregnancies. Because the egg doesn't make it as far as it should. Okay. The uterus then is the next section we'll talk a little bit about. It's located between the bladder and the rectum. It's kind of sandwiched in between the two there. It's one of the reasons why when women become pregnant, as this uterus starts to grow, they tend to have to go to the bathroom a little bit more often because the uterus is putting pressure not only on the bladder, but it's also putting pressure on the rectum, and then they usually can't have a bowel movement as easy as they would like to. All right, it's a hollow organ. And it has a couple different functions. So it's the site of implantation, not fertilization, remember, right? So it's just where the egg is going to be received and implant into the side of the uterus. It retains that fertilized egg, so it helps nourish it and allow it to grow. You're going to see here on the next slide, there's a little bit of a difference between humans and cats. So the fertilized eggs in humans make their way to the uterus. In cats, they actually stay within the fallopian tube itself. Okay, so here's the picture here of the cat. So here is your uterine tube. The ovary is right up here. Uterine tube is this structure right there. And then that's where they would stay. So this is a non-pregnant cat because the uterine tube is pretty flat. And then this one is a picture of one that is pregnant. You can see here's your uterine tube or fallopian tube, and there are fetuses within that uterine tube or fallopian tube. It does happen every once in a while. We end up with a cat when we do dissection that is pregnant. Okay. The uterus itself has three main regions. So there is what's called the body. That's the main portion of the uterus. It's kind of the middle portion. There's a portion called the fundus. That's the upper portion where the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes come into them. And then there is the cervix, which is the narrow outlet that protrudes down into the vaginal canal. All right, so this is the cervix down here. Okay. Inside of the uterus, there's a couple different linings. So there's an endometrium. This is the inner layer. That's the layer at which the fertilized egg will implant into. This is also the layer that is sloughed off if there is no pregnancy during the menstrual cycle. So the endometrium kind of gets sloughed off. There's a myometrium. So that's the middle layer, which is muscle tissue. Remember, myo means muscle. And then there's a serous layer, which is the outer layer, which pretty much all of our organs have. That kind of separate the uterus from everything else in the pelvic cavity. All right, the vagina would be the next portion that we are going to talk about. This is what serves as the birth canal. It also serves to accept the penis during intercourse. It extends from the cervix to the exterior of the body, and it's directly behind the bladder and in front of the rectum. All right, normally at the beginning, that opening to the vagina is closed off by what's called a hymen, and then that usually just simply becomes ruptured at some point in time during the woman's life. Okay, a couple other external structures. We have what's called the mons pubis. This is kind of this fatty material that sits over the top of the pubic symphysis. That's the joint between the two pelvic bones. And then that's also the area that becomes covered in pubic hair once the woman reaches puberty. There are two skin folds called labia. There's the labia majora and labia minor, so the major and minor. So the labia majora are the outer folds, right? They're much thicker, and then the inner folds are the labia minora. All right. There's an area called the vestibule that's inside of those labia. Okay. It actually contains the opening to both the urethra. There are some glands that produce mucus that are also inside of that opening. And then inside of that is also the clitoris just above that. One of the questions that a lot of times shows up on the exam is which organ of the female is the corresponding organ to the male penis. That would be the clitoris, right? It's erectile tissue, and it's essentially if there's testosterone present at birth, or not birth, at development, the clitoris turns into a penis. If there isn't testosterone and there's only estrogen present, it turns into a clitoris. All right, so we have to kind of remember that. But that's one of those questions that does show up. All right. Last little bit here about female anatomy is oogenesis. So this is the production of egg cells. All right. So the total supply of eggs that a woman has is present at birth. They don't grow any more eggs after birth. The ability to release those, though, doesn't start until they hit puberty. So usually around somewhere around age 13, a little before, a little after. And then oocytes are matured in a process in developing ovarian follicles that we looked at a little bit earlier. This whole process is driven by that hormone called the luteinizing hormone, or LH. All right. Let's see. You don't really need a whole lot of this. So the big thing here is that this process is happening under mitosis. To make a primary oocyte, and then the primary oocyte are surrounded by cells that form those follicles. Okay. All right, and then the rest of the process happens through meiosis, because remember we want to produce those types of cells with half the number of chromosomes here. Okay, meiosis is actually completed after ovulation, only if we have fertilization that takes place. So meiosis 1 will happen, then the egg gets released in ovulation, but meiosis 2 won't take place until after fertilization here. Okay, and this just kind of shows that basic process here in a diagram, but you won't see too many questions about that on the assessment. Okay. All right, so we're going to finish female anatomy a little bit, talking about the menstrual cycle itself. So this is the cyclic changes of the endometrium. It's driven by both estrogen and progesterone, and there are 3 main stages. So there's what's called menses. This is where the functional layer is actually sloughed off. So when that endometrium is being sloughed off, usually somewhere between days 1 to 5. There's then what we call the proliferative stage. This is where that endometrium is being regenerated, so that's days 6 to 14. And then the last phase is the secretory stage, where that endometrium starts to increase in size and get itself ready for implantation of hopefully a fertilized egg. And again, this is all driven by both estrogen as well as progesterone at this point, and that's days 15 to 28. Okay. You can see this is the cyclic process of the 2 hormones. There's a huge spike of both LH and FSH during that time. All right, and then this shows you kind of the progression of the ovary in relation to the menstrual cycle. So we start to get this primary follicle, so that primary egg cell at days 1 to 5. Ovulation, like I said, happens somewhere around day 14. All right, and that's right about the time that endometrium starts to kind of increase in size and get ready. All right, and then here's your corpus luteum that's producing progesterone and estrogen, keeping that layer healthy and viable. And then obviously, if we don't have anything that happens and there's not an egg that gets implanted that starts to produce its own hormones, all right, we start to see that lot drop off, and then we go back to day 1 again. Okay. Changes during implantation. So if the fertilized egg does reach the endometrium, it will start to secrete this hormone that I was just kind of mentioning a little bit ago, called the HCG. So the human chorionic gonadotropic hormone. All right. This is what keeps that endometrium viable during the entire pregnancy. This is also the hormone that they are looking for when they do a pregnancy test. Right. If it's present, then we know that we have a woman who is pregnant. Okay. The start and end of the menstrual cycle. So menarche is the start of it. Like we said, it usually happens around age 13. Can happen before, can happen after. To be honest with you, it's actually driven by weight. Once a female reaches about 100 pounds, then they are really actually healthy enough to have their first menstrual cycle. If they don't reach that 100 pounds at or before age 13, then it can be later. Especially in athletics, a lot of times what we'll see is athletes, because they tend to have less body fat, they can actually have later menarche because of that. And then menopause is just essentially when that process stops. And this usually occurs around age 51, there around, again, depending on processes. Okay. Ovulation, That's just the process of the mature egg being ejected from the ovary. And then again, the luteinizing hormone is responsible for that process. Okay. Last thing here with female anatomy, then, are mammary glands. They are present in both sexes, but they're really only functional in females. They are modified sweat glands, essentially. They function to produce milk after the baby has been born. And then the growth of them is stimulated by the sex hormones, mostly estrogen. Okay, there's a couple basic things you need to know. So we have the areola. That's the central pigmented area of the breast tissue. The nipple, then, it sits directly in the center of that. There are lobes, internal structures that actually radiate around that nipple. All right, so these are the lobes that you can kind of see here. The alveolar ducts are the clusters of milk-producing glands within those lobes. Right, and then there are what's called lactiferous ducts that connect the alveolar glands to the nipple. And those are the little structures that you see right here leading away from those lobes. Okay. All right. We'll go ahead and stop there with female. We're going to pick up tomorrow with pregnancy then. Okay.